my family had a business in Cuba from the 1830s because they were on the wrong side of, I guess, of the monarchy or something crazy like that. But they were back and forth, and they were sea people for the most part. They were like sea captains and that sort of thing, and they had businesses in absentia and as well as being there. They originally came from Catalonia. In fact, they spoke Catalonian as well as Castilian, so they came from places like Cadaqués, Barcelona, Girona, and as well as Palma de Mallorca, which is a little island in the Mediterranean where people speak Catalan. And anyways, my grandparents moved to Cuba in the 1920s. My grandfather kind of ran whatever that hardware business that was already in extent. And that's where my dad was born, in Santiago de Cuba. And then they decided, my grandfather decided to move back to Spain. Impeccable timing, just in time for the Spanish Civil War, or within a few years of the Spanish Civil War. And then while they were in Spain, they lived all over the place. They were in Bilbao and finally wound up in Morocco and Ceuta. And they managed to get back to Cuba in 1944, so they were kind of escaping what was a pretty bad situation in Iberia, and moved back to Santiago. He resumed whatever that business was, and they remained there. And my father went to University of Havana, and things got a little, it was during the Batista period, so it was actually dangerous, and so he came to North Carolina to go to college and stayed on in the United States. My grandparents, meanwhile, when Fidel came into power, they fled, and they were able to flee. They fled early 1960 with nothing but a suitcase. But before they fled, they sent me this little Cuban purse. And it was, I guess, when Fidel initially took over, a lot of people supported him, especially the folks in Santiago, because that was where he was from. And anyways, so they sent me this little purse, and the purse has some kind of interesting things. There's a palm tree, it's the royal palms, and the royal palms line the avenues of not just Santiago de Cuba, but also Havana. You know, they have these beautiful avenues and boulevards. The next thing is, it's a little worn, but it's the Cuban flag. And then next to that is a lady wearing a bata cubana, which is the national dress of Cuba. And the rooster, which could have been the cock that Jose Marti wrote about. So it's got all sorts of references. And it says Havana on the back, and it's Cuba here. It may have been an adult, oh dear, it's coming apart, an adult change purse. But for a little person that's, like a year and a half, this was my pocketbook. So anyways, after that, my grandparents fled, and they couldn't take anything out of the country. My grandmother actually hid her wedding ring in powders and things like that, so it looked like a cheap, costume jewelry. But they left everything, and I wound up in Milwaukee. So they left the beautiful, warm, sunny weather of Cuba. My grandfather at that point was retired. He was about 59, for the snow of Milwaukee. I'm not sure why they wound up in Milwaukee, but they did. And my grandfather had to start all over again from scratch. And after working for a few months, they realized he spoke a lot of languages, and so they bumped him up into, I think it was the marketing department from the factory, which was nice. So at least the last 10 years of working, because he worked until he was just about 70, at least it wasn't manual labor, because he was older. My grandmother never quite learned English, although she could understand it through a few floors, we discovered. They moved from Cuba, stayed with us for a bit, and then went to Florida, which was at least the warm weather that they loved. My grandmother always loved Cuba because of the warm weather. And so, they were no longer cradled in this beautiful place between the Sierra Maestra and the Siboney Playa, the beach. They were back at a beach in St. Petersburg, actually on a beach. It was a little island called Treasure Island. So that was where they lived their final days. I encountered discrimination at the school I was in, and that was, it wasn't, I thought it was me. I thought I had done something wrong, like all of a sudden people were acting different. And they were acting different because perhaps they heard things at home, and my last name was, you know, a Hispanic last name. And people that got to know my dad, you know, really liked my dad. But when people don't know you, they fall back to stereotypes and that sort of thing. So that was, you know, the truth of it. And I think I reacted kind of oddly as I grew older. I did not embrace my Latina background. Because my dad, we didn't speak Spanish in the house until my grandparents came to live with us. And I think it was because my father really wanted us to integrate as much as possible.